Alrighty, let's jump in here. Take my keys out of my pocket. Let's answer some questions from last time. Okay, off topic, what courses am I teaching next semester? Okay, so I've got 4, one of which is not going to be any use to any of you. So I'm teaching youth again, so you've already taken that, so sorry. 376, which is Sociology of Religion, which I am teaching, I can't remember which day. I want to say it's Tuesday, Thursdays from 11 to 12:20. I think that's when it is. It's currently full, but obviously there's always room to add more seats, likely as we get closer to the semester. Intro to Methods, I'm sure all of you want to take SOS 315 Intro to Methods with me. It's wild and fun, and there's lots of examples about furries, so that's always fun. And then I'm teaching 1 through St. Joseph's College, which is CHRTC 241, Catholicism and Pop Culture, and I think it's at 9:30 Tuesday, Thursdays, and it is a wild ride. It's super fun. I can tell you more about it if you're interested. You can come talk to me, or send me an email, and I'll send you a syllabus. Okay. Clear. Why does Gen Z think it's so easy to build a business? I don't know, because they see people online doing it. Do blue-collar jobs not give pensions? Very few of them do, right? It used to be really normal that something like the auto workers would have a pension, but increasingly, right, people are expected to use tools like RRSPs and TFSAs to save for their own retirement and don't have pensions. It's really only union jobs and especially public sector workers that still have employer pensions. Yay, professors. Would I say Gen Z moves more towards blue-collar or white-collar jobs? Obviously, it's always going to be a mix, right? And it's highly stratified by social class. I think the trajectory has been that more people are, excuse me, I'm about to sneeze, are moving up into white-collar jobs, away from very tangible, like blue-collar trades work into the service industries, more so than like construction or manufacturing. Or agriculture or resource extraction, right? The economy's shifted broadly from about 80% of it being manufacturing back in the 1940s to about 80% of it being in the service sector today. Okay. All right, so I guess we left off with this slide. I don't want to rehash anything because I think I spent 15 solid minutes on this slide. We're going to talk a little bit more this class, if I can fight off this sneeze that keeps wanting to come back, about like what the picture looks like specifically in Canada today. And I mean, it's not necessarily the rosiest picture out there for people, but let's start with a couple of basics on work. Okay, so typically, bless you, Canadians age 15 to 30, less likely to have jobs than older Canadians, right? Now that makes sense, especially towards the lower end of that range, right? When you're talking like 15 to 22, 23, you're talking about people who are largely still engaged in education, right? High school up until like 18 years old, 17, 18 years old, and then university or some kind of, post-secondary education into the early part of the 20s. Once you get out of that, right, that's when it gets a little bit dicier because obviously past that point, most people have completed their basic set of education. Okay, so 2019, and this is the last really good StatsCan numbers that I could find that were compiled in a pretty easy to use format where I wasn't having to like download tables and figure them out for myself. I just don't have time. Like I said, I did all this in an hour. Percentage of the youth population that was employed was about 67.3%, lower than their counterparts aged 31 to 47, 83.7, and 45 to 54 at 83.6. Okay, now there's some nuance to that number in how unemployment is calculated. right? Or how employment rates are calculated versus how, say, something like unemployment is calculated. There's a lot of those young people in that, 15 to, where was that? Youth population. It doesn't have the ages there, but below 31, right? So 15 to 29, who are not going to be employed because they're in school, right? Which leads to that lower participation rate, or they are just entering the job market, right? Coming out of school. And so you get a couple of things that happen typically. One is people will delay their entry into the job market until they find a good fit, right? And one of the things that's almost universally true about looking for a job is that once you have a job, finding another job gets really difficult because all of your job search time is taken up by the job that you currently have. And the more intense that job is in terms of hours, the more difficult it is for you to go and find another job. So a lot of people will actually delay their entry into the job market, if they can, while they look for a job that is a good fit for their skills and interests. Others who don't have that luxury will jump in and take a job, right? Usually something they're not particularly well suited for, probably something in like retail or hospitality industries that pay the bills while they are looking. So big difference in kind of employment rates. But, some of that is explainable. Okay, now, if you ever wanted an argument for why you should stay in school, more education equals a better rate of employment to a degree. And I will say, the difference is once you get, past here, the post-secondary degree certificate or diploma, in terms of employment rate, are relatively modest, right? So if you look, less than a high school education, right, for all people, fewer than, 35% are employed. Now, if you exclude, part-time students, people with less than a high school education, it's just a little bit over 50, roughly, kind of trending towards 60% that are employed. But that's pretty bad, right? That's not great. So definitely, finish high school. If you finish high school, excluding our college and university students, our rate goes up into the high 70s, low 80s. And then when we get to, any other kind of post-secondary education, it jumps up, well into the high 80s, kind of low 90s in terms of employment rates, right? And yeah, 9 in 10 or 88.9% of young bachelor's degree holders not in full-time school were employed in 2019. So having a bachelor's degree, doesn't guarantee that you'll have a job, but the odds are pretty good, right? If you had a 9 in 10 shot at just about anything, you'd probably take it because, that's pretty good odds. So yeah, it's 52% of their counterparts with no high school diploma that had a job that year, right? And these trends will continue all throughout the life course. Now, what I will say, right, in terms of just straight up employment, these three lines are basically the same, right? So there's not a whole lot of difference here in terms of employment rate between if you just have a post-secondary certificate or diploma, right, a 2-year certificate or diploma, a bachelor's degree or above a bachelor's degree. In fact, having a master's or a PhD appears to make it ever so slightly less likely that you will be employed. Like just a smidge, right? Okay. Now, that said, if we look at real hourly wages, right, that is, a somewhat different story. And we see here, again, a pretty strong case to be made for more education in terms of, how much money you're going to make. And what you see, right, less than a high school diploma in 2019 dollars, right, you're looking at, $17 an hour. When you go up to your bachelor's degree, you're up at 23 on average. Or sorry, your post-secondary degree, that's post-secondary certificate or diploma. Bachelor's degree gets even better. Right now, you're up at an average wage about 26 to 28 or 27. And your, if you have master's degree or above, right, you're looking at about $30 an hour. So generally speaking, right, and it gets, there's a little bit of a difference if you look at, your full-time employees rather than all employees, but overall, generally speaking, right, you want to have more education, you will make more money, and you step up the ladder the more education that you have. So don't be this person, and obviously all of you are here, so you're trying to be, the red line. But you can see, right, where when we're talking about education, high school dropouts, right, that's those guys, that's bad. Just high school, you see the increasing economic sort of, how should we say? I don't want to say insolvency, that's not the right word, but from an economic perspective, just a high school diploma today is not putting you in a very good position. You at least want to have that 2-year certificate or you're in big trouble, right? Okay. Any questions? Why would it drop off a bit after a bachelor's degree? Okay, there's a couple of possible reasons. One of them is kind of a skills mismatch, right? Potentially doing graduate work maybe leaves you with a sort of skills mismatch with the market, or you're overeducated potentially. There's going to be some of that as well, like when we look here, especially when we're looking at, where did I have it here? For employment rates, there's going to be some people that say have a master's and are working towards a PhD, a small number that might affect that number as well, right? So they're continuing in education even though they already have a master's degree. How are wage statistics affected by Alberta having a much lower minimum wage? As a percentage of Canadian workers, Alberta workers, and especially Alberta's minimum wage workers, are not a tremendous chunk of the workforce in Canada. If you were to look at Alberta statistics only, right, that median, that wage, especially at the bottom here, in these two categories, is going to be lower because they're going to be making a minimum wage that I can't remember what Alberta's minimum wage is. I want to say it's like $16, but it could be $14. And I think there's a even lower one for people under a certain age. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I'm sure someone will put them in the comments. But that would mostly affect people at the bottom here. That is still a relatively, in terms of minimum wage workers in Alberta, if we look at the national average, that's going to be a really small number of workers, easily sort of compensated for by bigger provinces like Ontario and Quebec that have much bigger populations. Okay. Employment rates and unemployed rates by age or group. Okay. So a couple of things to just sort of note here. Men and women have had very different kind of trends if we talk about kind of where they are in the labor market, right? And what their trajectories have been. And what you see, right, is men's position has been roughly kind of flat-ish, right? With slight declines in overall employment, especially for those 15 to 30, right? And you see especially a big dip right here, right, in terms of employment rate. Now, is it historically unprecedented? No, because it's not that far from the big dip that would have happened at the beginning of the 1980s when we had a very big recession. And we haven't seen the other end of that curve to see if it recovers yet, right? Because this data only goes to 2020. Women's employment rates, however, and because they started at a much lower level, because back in the 70s, fewer women were in the workforce, right? What we've seen is kind of consistently a pretty steady climb for women of all ages. And again, a dip at 2020, that's pandemic, right? So that screws up the numbers right there. Unemployment rate, kind of similar stories. Men's, as you notice, are a little bit bumpier than women's, especially in this youngest part of the cohort, right? That 15 to 30, it's a little bit bumpier because of the industries that young men tend to work in, right? Many more young men employed in industries that are more vulnerable to recession. So things like the trades, right? Construction, so trades, and manufacturing. The industries that women tend to be engaged in are a little bit more recession-proof, although, you still see it's kind of on the bumpier side here, right? Especially compared to older workers. So again, young workers, generally more vulnerable to macroeconomic conditions. Young women's, it's bumpy, it's just not, the waves aren't as big. Women are more likely to be engaged in things like teaching, nursing, social work, childcare, retail, hospitality, beauty services, all of which are a little bit more recession-proof than things like construction and manufacturing, because the demand is more constant, right? So, and again, 2020 sort of spikes for both. All right. Where is my mouse? When can you expect your midterm 1 marks back? When I get them completed. That's the worst answer ever. So you wrote on Wednesday, so that'll be a week from, 2 days from now, and give me another week after that at least. 2 weeks is roughly my goal, to get everything back in 2 weeks. And I will forego sleeping if I must to get that done. Okay, types of jobs, right? One of the big concerns, especially with young workers, is the degree to which they are increasingly precariously employed, which means they are in sort of non-career jobs and jobs where they are easily fired in economic downturns, right? So part-time work is probably one of the big precarious types of precarious employment, and you kind of see it on all of these slides, right? So self-employed workers, right, are young workers, or the smallest proportion of that if we take all individuals. Same if we take excluding full-time students. Full-time employees for all individuals, right, our youngest part of the cohort, or youngest part of the population is generally, again, the least likely to be employed full-time in a permanent job, and the most likely to be employed in some kind of, precarious work. I'm trying to remember what the second chart was. Okay. I don't remember why I looked at this when I was looking at it, and I now don't remember why there are 2 charts here. All individuals. I don't remember what the bottom charts are. It will come to me in a second. But basically, right, everything you can see here, right, we have much more precarious employment, fewer part-time workers, in our youngest part of the population, right? So they're much more likely to be engaged in precarious employment. Okay, this one's, how shall we say, a little bit troubling. So this is a term, we'll come back to it later, NEET, right? But this is neither, basically not engaged in employment, education, or training, or NEET, right? This is basically describing a group of people that is sort of both educationally and economically, not engaged in education or, not employed in education or training, right? Not employed is E, in education or training, right? That's NEET. So these are economically and educationally inactive individuals. So what do we see? These are basically people who've fallen out of the economy. People who are not working, they're not being educated, right? So they're not training towards work, and they're not doing another form of training like an apprenticeship. So economically inactive. And what we see is pretty, decent chunks of our young part of the cohort, right? Our late teens and emerging adults, who are economically and educationally inactive. Okay, and I'll point out a couple of things. More common for men, right? In this youngest part of the cohort, a little over 5%. Once we get into 20 to 24, we're in the kind of mid-teens. For men, it stays about there once they get into that 25 to 30 group, and then women sort of jump up beyond. to about 15%. Now this one is rather easy to explain because that jump is going to be mostly women who are now, mothers and who are engaged in childcare, right? So they're not working, they're not being educated, they're not training. They're now, this chunk that spread between these two lines is mostly going to be women who are now taking care of children at home. Okay, so again, what you see is when we talk about individuals, and these are individuals that are going to struggle a lot, right? Because they're not working, they're not likely, bless you, going to be working anytime in the future because they're not training towards anything. They're just kind of stepped out of the labor force. Now, not employed is one thing. They might be looking for work. Generally speaking, people who are in need aren't. But when they're not also involved in any education or training, it suggests these are people who've just fallen out of the labor force and sort of given up. And again, the pattern we see is it's most common for those with either less than a high school education or just a high school diploma, right? It goes, it's less likely, for those who move up in the education scale, again, until it kind of reverses with those above a bachelor's degree, presumably because at a certain point, you're not able to get any more education, so you might just be struggling to find any kind of work, or just kind of stepped out because you can't find any kind of work, probably because of a skills mismatch in that case. And again, a little bit of a difference. There's not a huge difference in terms of Canadians and immigrants who are in this category, although immigrants are just a little bit more likely not to be engaged or not to be employed, engaged in education or training. Okay. Hang on. Why doesn't okay, that is just, all right, that is a really complicated question. Obviously, there's all sorts of barriers for homeless individuals to seeking work, right? No fixed address being one of them, difficult to apply, and a lot of mental illness. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit Gen Z struggles here. And this is an area with a lot of speculation and a lot of different possible explanations. And I've kind of, focused in on a couple here from a couple of different sources. Now, I'll get to my disclaimer in a second, because I'm taking a lot of this information from a bunch of different places. Like I've got some stuff from Rich Diaz, who's the chief financial analyst at IceCap Asset Management, who's an interesting kind of commentator. And I've got some from immigration lawyers and some politics stuff as well. And I've got a disclaimer before I talk about a few things on the next slide. But I will sort of set up the frame here. Okay, so when talking about youth unemployment, now youth unemployment in Canada, where is my chart of youth unemployment? I don't know where I have it. Oh, maybe I took it out. Okay, youth unemployment today in Canada stands somewhere in the high teens, right? So somewhere between 17%, and in Alberta, youth unemployment stands at about 20%, right? So about 1 in 5 young people in Alberta are unable to find work. This is, how shall we say, what's the word, bad, right? Young people being able, especially those who have now exited education, being unable to find work can lead to a bunch of things, right? Obviously people entering that kind of NEET category, or potentially brain drain, right? If you can't find work here, chance that you're going to move somewhere where you can find work, and increasingly, that place is called, the United States, means we're losing a lot of talented young people who bring a lot of assets and who we've frankly spent a lot of money training, through our education systems. And this is kind of weird, right? Because if you remember when we were talking, our generations, we have a weird sort of, generational bubble at the moment, right? It's kind of skinny on the top, fat in the 70, I guess now 80 to 65 range. And then it kind of gets thinner down towards the bottom. So we have a lot of older retiring workers. I don't know what this is supposed to be, by the way. This is me trying to draw a pyramid of age distribution in the funny way that it looks in Canada. We have a lot of older people who are now hitting retirement age, our baby boomers, and not a lot of young workers. So, generally speaking, what you would expect according to Diaz is, as the boomers retire, what we should see in Canada is labor shortages in the market. And generally speaking, it should be across the market because the boomers are retiring, in all occupations, from upper management down to, blue collar workers, plumbers, carpenters, all of that jazz. They're hitting retirement age across the board. What we should expect is, because there's labor shortages, we should see rises in youth wages as employers fight to attract young workers. And I would argue, just based kind of on anecdotals, that this is what we saw in Canada right up until about the year 2015, is we saw nothing important happen in 2015. We saw, across Canada, there were labor shortages, and even people at the kind of base of the labor market, right, in the service industry, retail, hospitality, food services, were fighting to attract young workers, as it was harder to find older workers. I remember, it's Alberta, so we had the oil and gas crazy contributing to this as well. But I remember places like Starbucks and McDonald's advertising, like $30 an hour and scholarships, right? Free uniforms and scholarships, right? If you went to work at Starbucks and you stayed there through your university, they would give you a scholarship to help you pay for your university. Okay, now this starts to change around 2015. There is an economic slowdown, just part of it, but there's other things that happened as well. The other thing that should happen is an increased focus on productivity. Do I have the definition of economic productivity? I do have it on the next slide. Okay, I'll just jump to that for a second. What is productivity? So, productivity, I take this from Investopedia. Economic productivity is a critical factor in determining standard of living, and basically it is measured by efficiency with which goods and services are produced compared to, so it's a GDP, right? Productivity is a GDP, worker productivity to GDP kind of output. So generally speaking, if you have a high productivity economy, it takes less work to produce more goods and services, right? You're producing them at a lower cost because you're producing them with less man hours, which means each worker is generating more actual assets, more capital, more goods, more services with less work. So you have to put in less work to get more out. So generally, what higher productivity means higher wages, which allows individuals to command better compensation and improve their living standards, right? So typically productivity growth in advanced economies is linked with economic growth, and so what you get is a higher GDP per capita, right? So basically, GDP per capita is you take the gross domestic product of a country and you divide it by the population. And that's your GDP per capita. And generally speaking, countries with a higher GDP per capita have higher living standards. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. All right, now, those three predictions, right, that Diaz has, none of them have actually happened in Canada. Through this period, basically from when the boomers start to retire, right around, the 2010s, should be around where we start to see, our boomers retiring because they're hitting 65, 70 years old. Youth unemployment stays generally pretty high. Obviously spikes during COVID, but even now we're well past COVID, and it is higher than it has been historically. All right, so youth wages have risen. I think I have a chart showing you youth wages in a sec, but at a slower rate than the wages of older workers and well below the overall rate of inflation. And the really important one in Canada, productivity in Canada has lagged behind the US in particular, but a lot of countries. And if you look at my fancy dancy chart, this is productivity levels. Canada, this is the OECD, Organization of the acronym, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and you see Canada sitting, really middle of the pack, well behind, a lot of European countries, and well behind the United States in terms of productivity. Okay, so going back to my 3 causes, right? I have them numbered, right? So number 1, as the boomers retire, we should see labor shortages in the market. What Diaz argues is that this has largely been undermined by the importation of cheap labor into Canada via the temporary foreign worker program. Okay, now here's where I want to put my disclaimer. Because a lot of people will use this kind of data to essentially make a racist argument, right? Foreign workers are coming in and taking jobs. I actually think that is sort of putting the blame in the wrong place, right? Temporary foreign workers as a class, very poorly treated in the Canadian economy, but the people who are not coming because they intend some kind of malice. It's because we've created an incentive structure that incentivizes them to come, right? They can earn higher wages here than they could in their home countries. And so as rational economic actors, they come, right? The blame here is not on the people coming, it's on the policymakers. And I'll talk about that in a second, because I think the policymakers are largely captured by our good friend, corporations, right? And I'll talk about them in a sec. So, it's easy to make a kind of like, oh, immigrants are stealing our jobs kind of argument. But that, I think, in itself is a sort of distraction to the broader problem, which is a problem of public policy, right? Okay, so I love this one. And I'll show you a quote in a sec. Massive source of cheap labor, and at times, slave labor. I have a kind of quote from a UN envoy that looked at Canada's temporary foreign worker program and said it was a breeding ground for modern day forms of slavery, which is super fun, right? Okay, since 2020, the temporary foreign worker program used to be largely focused on a couple sectors: agriculture and skilled labor, right? Especially the tech sector. That used to be where we brought in most of our temporary foreign workers, right? And the temporary foreign workers in agriculture would come to help at harvest time, right? Because it's hard for farmers to find enough people to do agricultural work, so they would bring in foreign workers, largely from Latin America, Mexico and Latin America, who do a lot of that work and then typically leave and go back home. And it was a sort of cycle. And then with skilled workers, right, especially in the tech sector, where you couldn't find people to work, you would bring in temporary foreign workers and give them a path to permanent residency. But since 2020, the majority of TFWs are employed in low-skilled occupations. And here's where, the argument gets a little dicey, which often would have been, sources of employment for young people, right? Those kind of starter careers or starter jobs for young people to get a little bit of experience and a little bit of time in the workforce under their feet. Okay, the other one, right? Low-skilled workers tend to be low productivity workers, right? If you're working in food services, or hospitality or the industries where we see a lot of temporary foreign workers, they're pretty low skilled and therefore low productivity. So it likely contributes to Canada's lagging productivity, though it's not the only thing. And yeah, it's hard to say. I've seen the number of temporary foreign workers in Canada anywhere between 1.56 million and 845,000. I put the lower number here, but it's something like 7.9%. Oops, what did I do? I selected the wrong thing. 7.9% of Canada's population today is made up of temporary residents, a lot of whom are temporary foreign workers. Okay, so again, don't blame the temporary foreign workers. All right, So, TFW, facing that second point, so I have to go back to my second point. Labor shortages should mean that young workers can demand higher wages as employers fight to attract them in a scarce labor market, right? And this is a supply and demand argument, right? When you have the scarcity of some asset in the economy, demand goes up, prices go up. And so if we'd sort of left things alone, what you would have is rising wages for young people. Instead, temporary foreign workers and other categories, we'll talk about international students in a sec, have largely been requested by corporations to facilitate large profits, right? Now, there's a bunch of different ways this happens, and I'll tell you some of the arguments in a sec, but one of the things that's really clear with TFWs is that they are frequently abused by their employers. And here, if you talk to people who deal with temporary foreign workers a lot, one of the things that you learn is especially franchisees of things like Tim Hortons and McDonald's will often bring in temporary foreign workers. That worker is actually tied to the job, right? So they were hired to work at that specific Tim Hortons or McDonald's. They do not have the right, once they are here, to leave that job and take their skills elsewhere. So they're tied to that job. And often what has happened is the franchisees will also rent them housing, right? So they're getting, essentially it's a form of economic double dipping where that person cannot leave, right? They cannot leave. If they quit that job, they end up getting sent back. And so economically, the whole bet kind of did not pay off. And they're often like, okay, you can stay, but you have to stay in a house that I own. They'll often rent it, to large numbers of TFWs at the same time. So the person who owns the Timmy's, right, or the Canadian Tire franchise or McDonald's or whatever will get profit off of the work of that worker, pay them really typically pretty low wages, and charge them rent on the other side. So they're sort of profiting from them on two sides, right? And this has been known about temporary foreign workers going back beyond 2015, right? This was a complaint in the Harper years. It just got a bunch worse under Trudeau and now under Carney. Okay. Share of TFWs working in food services and retail went from 34% in 2011 to 42% in 2021. An independent UN rights expert described the system as a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery. Now, despite the fact that advocates for the program will make the opposite argument, right? It's pretty clear, and Trudeau at the end of his tenure in 2024 essentially admitted as much, that the program basically creates downward pressures on wages. Not so much by, lowering wages, because the TFW program, you have to pay like kind of the going rate in the economy, but because it increases labor supply, right, it decreases sort of the power of workers, right? So if you can't find a worker willing to work at the prevailing rate, you import a temporary foreign worker, and over time this just increases your labor supply, weakening the position of workers. Okay, the last one, productivity. So this last point, right? What you should see is increased productivity, right? As employers having less labor supply are forced to innovate and find ways to increase per worker productivity. That largely hasn't happened. Instead, employers in Canada have imported huge numbers of low-skilled workers, right? Which has meant you don't need to innovate, so your GDP per capita, your productivity doesn't grow. And like I said, Canada, we know, has lagged in productivity, especially behind the United States for, about a decade now. Now, poor economic policies, such things like zero interest rates, have also incentivized capital. So in Canada, for a really long time, we had really, really low interest rates. And I get in this class a lot of questions about why you can't afford a house, right? Why Gen Z can't afford a house. Well, one of the big reasons is this. So the Bank of Canada, this was true under Harper. It was especially true under the 10 years of Justin Trudeau's tenure. held the interest rate in Canada, right, the central bank rate, which affects things like mortgage rates, very, very low. And we could say near zero, right? Like, for instance, when I bought the house that I'm living in now, the interest rate that we got was like 1.79%. Now, sadly, we're renewing our mortgage in a month, and that number is going to go up. Not that bad, though, only about 2% higher. We're doing okay. But that is basically a 0% interest rate. I know it's not actually zero, but it's really, really low. And what this has done is incentivized people to pay a lot for housing. So what ends up happening is it looks like the price of housing is jumping up. This is especially true when millennials kind of jumped into the housing market. A whole bunch of people started buying housing, right? And you had bidding wars. Why? Well, because an extra 10 or 20 or 50 or even $100,000, bid above list price didn't cost you that much because of the low interest rate, right? It was going to cost you, an extra $200-300 a month, which you basically could afford. What this did was it drove the price of housing up. Combined with, a lot of immigration, especially in the last couple of years, it has meant people want to put their money in housing, right? But housing is a non-productive asset, right? Once it's built, it doesn't really do anything, right? It kind of passively gains value, but it doesn't increase productivity in the economy. If companies had invested that same money in better machinery, better, manufacturing techniques, all of those kinds of things, GDP per capita would have risen, right? And we'd probably look more like the United States. But everybody dumped their money into housing because it was the easiest way to make money in Canada. And money is like water. It flows to, in the sense that it flows down the path of least resistance, the path where it can make the most money. So, bad policy in terms of labor, right? Overemphasizing unskilled labor and incentivizing poor, like non-productive capital assets has negatively affected Gen Z. Yeah, please. The green line, okay, so green lines here, I believe are, I'd have to check. I don't remember why. I'd have to look at this chart again. I believe those are the ones that have been moving positively, and Canada's the one that has been moving negatively, right? If I recall. And the other ones have been sort of like flat. Man, wouldn't it be nice to live in Luxembourg, though? Or Ireland? Ireland's a weird one. Ireland's all financial services, right? Everything in Ireland went to financial services when they became like a dumping ground for all of the capital that people didn't want taxed in the EU. It became like a kind of like the Caymans, a money haven. And so GDP per capita in Ireland went up. Everybody moved into banking. That's kind of over. But yeah, I'm pretty sure if I remember, the green lines are those that are moving positively, and the US has been moving positively, and Canada is the only one that's kind of been moving down. The others are basically kind of stagnant overall. Okay. Why isn't there more? Well, there is. You have a lot of people from India. You have a lot of people from the Philippines. And now increasingly we're seeing more people from different African nations. So we are seeing a fair bit of diversity amongst TFWs. I think one of the reasons, India is just a really big place, right? It has a huge population. So there's a lot of people that come in from India. Okay. What do I have here? So I have another perspective. I have 4 minutes. Oh my gosh, where does the time go? Me talking, sadly. All right. So Mark Holth, who's a immigration lawyer, so kind of someone with a vested interest. He kind of argues with the point I've been making, right, in terms of temporary foreign workers, being part of the problem. Basically suggesting the program is designed not to affect the prevailing wage rate, right? It's designed not to put downward pressure on wages. So basically, you have to pay TFWs whatever the prevailing rate is. But if that's minimum wage, right, that's minimum wage. There's a lot of ways around this, too. And again, he's an immigration lawyer, so part of what he does is help people get labor market impact assessments to get people over here. What he blames is international students, who obtain 3-year open work permits after they graduate. And of course, we've seen this, stories coming out of places like Ontario of essentially fake colleges that were set up to bring in international students, give them, sort of worthless diplomas and allow them to jump into the labor market, right? It's a corrupt system that exploits people. Wow, I sound like such a Marxist today. Viva la révolution. Down with the bourgeois pigs. What? Oh, you are a bourgeois pig? Oh, my bad. Down with me. Not that I employ anyone. Okay, so, his point is that actually it is, a lot the international students that have driven down the wages, because they'll go and for that 3 years, they don't actually have to work at the prevailing labor rate. They can be like, I'll work as a manager at McDonald's for minimum wage, and that's what the franchisees will pay them. That said, I think, even there, either way, what you're doing is increasing labor supply. So where you should have a labor shortage and therefore good working conditions and low youth unemployment, we're seeing the opposite happening, right? Yeah, this from Desjardins. Canada's decision to relax work restrictions for non-permanent residents, including allowing international students to work more than 20 hours per week during the pandemic, led to a sharp increase in the population growth of young workers between 20 and 24. However, as the pandemic moved into the rearview mirror and economic activity normalized, this deluge of available labor well outpaced demand, and putting upward pressure on youth unemployment, right? And downward, when you have a lot of available labor supply, it's hard for young workers to demand better wages or benefits. That one is kind of obvious. Okay, I have 1 minute. Can I do the slide in 1 minute? Oh, right, I added this today, so you're just gonna have to write this down. Da-da-da-da. I keep adding things because I'm evil. Why don't I leave it here? We'll come back. We'll start with government policy on Wednesday. I'm having fun. I have this terrible quote from Mark Carney to share with you. We'll go with that. All right, we'll pick this up on Wednesday and tell you how doomed you all are. All right. Okay.